Victor Crow didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved open the door of Blackstone Station's only telegraph office like he owned the building, because last spring he'd bought the man who ran it. He dropped a folded paper on the counter, smoothed it with one thick finger, and looked at the clerk with the particular kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "Make sure that wire reaches the agency in Philadelphia before sundown," he said. "Tell them the position at the Rowan Ranch has already been filled. Tell them not to send anyone." The clerk's hand trembled as he reached for the paper. Victor was already walking out. He didn't look back. He never had to. In Blackstone County, when Victor Crow decided something was finished, it was finished. And right now he had decided that Silas Rowan's last fighting chance, whatever capable woman that employment agency might send, would never arrive. The only question was whether the wire would reach Philadelphia before the westbound train left the station. It didn't. So, if you've ever been the person everyone counted out before you even opened your mouth, stay with me. This story is for you. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the stories we tell on this channel have a way of reaching people who need them most. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now let's go back to 1883, to a train platform, and a little girl who saw something in a stranger that her father was too stubborn and too broken to see himself. The train from the east arrived 40 minutes late, which in October of 1883 on the Wyoming frontier meant arriving in near darkness, in cold that had teeth. Silas Rowan stood at the far end of the platform with his hat pulled low and his jaw set in that particular way his ranch hand, Old Denny, called the brick wall face. It wasn't an expression that invited conversation. It was an expression that said, "I have already decided this is going to go wrong, so let's get it over with." Beside him, holding his left hand with both of hers, stood Lydia. She was 5 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's tendency to go completely still when she was paying close attention to something. Right now she was paying close attention to the train as it groaned and hissed into the station, its iron wheels screaming against the rails in a way that made the other adults wince. Lydia didn't wince. She just watched. "Is she on this one, Papa?" "Don't know yet." "I think she is." Silas didn't answer that. He'd learned in 5 years of raising this particular child that some of the things Lydia said with certainty were better left without a response, because arguing with her felt strange in a way he couldn't quite name. The doors opened. Passengers came down in clusters. A drummer with too many cases. A family of 4 who all looked exhausted and slightly defeated. 2 men in suits who were clearly not staying, clearly just passing through on their way to somewhere they considered more important than here. Silas watched the door. The woman who stepped off last was not what he had asked for. He knew it the instant he saw her, the same way you know a tool is wrong for the job before you even pick it up. She was somewhere around 30, maybe a year or two either side, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a traveling hat that still looked too neat after what must have been 4 days on a train. She carried one large trunk and a smaller bag, and she stood on the platform and looked out at Blackstone Station. The way a person looks at a math problem they haven't solved yet. Not frightened, not thrilled, just measuring. She wore gloves. Good ones. Silas's jaw tightened another notch. He'd asked the agency for a frontier-experienced woman. Someone who knew what it meant to run a household in conditions that would break most people. Someone who could handle the work, the isolation, the weather, the particular kind of loneliness that settled into a house when the nearest neighbor was 11 miles east and the nearest town was the place he was standing in right now, which was barely a town at all. The woman standing on the platform had never seen the frontier in her life. He'd bet everything he had left on that, and right now, everything he had left wasn't much. He took one step forward. Then Lydia's hand tightened in his, and he stopped. "That's her, Papa." "Lydia, that's the one." He looked down at his daughter. She was staring at the woman with the measuring eyes and the good gloves, and on Lydia's face was an expression he hadn't seen since before her mother died. It was the expression of a child who has already made up her mind and is simply waiting for the adults around her to catch up. Something moved in Silas's chest that he immediately tried to suppress. He walked forward anyway. "Miss Prescott?" She turned at her name without flinching, which he noticed. A lot of women flinched a little when a man Silas's size spoke to them without much preamble. She just turned, took him in with those steady dark eyes, and said, "Mr. Rowan?" "That's right." "Naomi Prescott, from the Hartwell Agency." She extended her hand. Not a delicate hand exactly, but clearly not a hand that had spent much time in dirt. "I believe you were expecting me." "I was expecting someone else." A pause. She didn't fill it right away, which also told him something. Most people rush to fill pauses. She let it sit there between them for a moment before she said simply, "I understand. The agency informed me there may have been some miscommunication. What they told you is that someone canceled the original candidate." She went still, just slightly. "What do you mean?" "The woman I hired, a Mrs. Calloway from Denver, experienced references I'd checked myself. She wired me 3 days ago to say the agency told her the position was withdrawn. I sent back saying I'd done no such thing." He watched her face. "The agency wired again. Said there was some confusion, that they were sending who they had available." His eyes moved briefly to the gloves again. "Who they had available was you." Naomi Prescott was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you believe someone interfered with the arrangement?" It wasn't a question. He looked at her more carefully. "I don't know yet," he said. "But you suspect it." "Miss Prescott, I suspect most things. It's kept me alive out here." He picked up her trunk before she could protest. Not out of chivalry exactly, more out of the habit of efficiency, and started walking toward the wagon. "The question now is what we do about it. You've come a long way. I won't send you back tonight." "I wasn't planning to go back," she said, keeping pace with him easily, which he also noticed. "Not tonight and not otherwise, Mr. Rowan, unless you have a genuine objection to my presence. Do you?" He stopped walking. She stopped too, standing there in the cold of the platform with the last light dying behind the hills, and she looked at him with an expression that was patient, but not passive, waiting, but not weak. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 5. She lost her mother 14 months ago. She doesn't need someone who's going to decide this is too hard and get on the next train east." "I'm a school teacher," Naomi said. "Or I was for 8 years. I've dealt with 30 children at once in a room with no heat in a Pennsylvania winter. I'm not afraid of hard." "This is different." "I expect it is." She looked out toward the wagon, toward the dark hills beyond, toward whatever was out there that he was warning her about. But different isn't the same as impossible. From behind Silas's left knee came a voice. "I like her, Papa." He looked down. Lydia had her arms wrapped around his leg and was looking up at Naomi Prescott with complete unguarded certainty. Naomi looked back down at her. Something passed between them. Silas couldn't have named it if he'd tried, couldn't have described what exactly shifted in the air in that moment. Naomi crouched down, right there on the cold platform, coat and all, so she was eye level with his daughter. "You must be Lydia," she said. "Yes." "I'm Naomi. I've never been to Wyoming before. Do you think you could teach me some things about it?" Lydia considered this with the seriousness of a small judge evaluating a large case. Then she nodded, once, firmly. "I know where the rabbit holes are," she said, "and where the ice is thin in the creek." "That sounds like exactly what I need to know." Naomi stood, brushed the dust from her coat, and looked at Silas. "Shall we go?" Silas Rowan stood there for a moment with his daughter's hand back in his and a stranger's steady eyes watching him, and felt something he hadn't felt in over a year. Not hope. He was too careful for hope. But something adjacent to it. Something he didn't quite trust yet. He turned toward the wagon. "It's a cold ride," he said. 40 minutes at least." "Then we'd better start," said Naomi Prescott, and picked up her own smaller bag. The ride was cold. He hadn't been wrong about that. Naomi sat on the wagon bench beside Silas and didn't complain once, which he'd expected her to do within the first 10 minutes. Most people from the East complained about the cold here, about the dark, about the particular quality of silence that pressed down over the land once you got away from any lights at all. It wasn't like Eastern silence. It had weight to it. It had the kind of presence that made some people feel watched. Naomi sat in it with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the dark shapes of the hills like she was reading them. Lydia had fallen asleep against Naomi's side within the first 15 minutes. Just tipped over and dropped into sleep the way small children can, completely and without warning, with absolute trust in whatever surface they'd chosen. Naomi had gone still when it happened, adjusted carefully so the child was more comfortable, and that was all. Silas drove and didn't say much. He was trying to figure out how to say what needed to be said, which was that she should understand the situation fully before they arrived, because the situation was worse than he'd made it sound. "The creek," he said finally. She looked at him. "The ranch stays alive because of one thing, a creek that runs along the western boundary. Good water, doesn't run dry in summer, doesn't freeze completely in winter. There's not much else like it in this county." He kept his eyes forward. "Victor Crow has been trying to get that creek for 6 years. Bought the land to the north of me, the land to the south of me. Made offers on my place 3 times. The kind of offers that sound generous until you realize that once you accept them, you've got nowhere else to go, and he's got everything. You didn't accept them." "No." "What happened to the last candidate, Mrs. Calloway?" A pause. "You think Crow interfered with it?" "I think Crow knows that a man alone on an isolated ranch with a small child has fewer options than a man with a functioning household around him. I think he's been patient. I think something changed recently that made him decide patience was over." He glanced at her. "I don't know what that something is yet." Naomi was quiet for a moment, then, "The survey." He looked at her sharply. "What?" "A neighboring landowner trying to seize water rights would typically do it one of 2 ways: an outright purchase, which you've refused, or a legal challenge based on property surveys. If he recently found someone willing to produce fraudulent survey documents that would explain the change in timeline," she said it the way she'd say something obvious. "Is there a county court sitting in Blackstone?" "There's a circuit judge comes through every 2 months. Next session is 6 weeks out. Then he has 6 weeks to prepare a challenge, which means he's probably already started." She looked back at the hills. "Do you have your original land grant documentation?" Silas stared at her for long enough that the horse started to drift left, and he had to correct it. "Who are you?" he said. It came out more plainly than he intended, less like an accusation and more like a genuine question, the way you'd ask it when someone shows you something you didn't know existed. Naomi glanced at him sideways. "A schoolteacher," she said, "from Pennsylvania, whose father was a land records clerk for 20 years and whose brother is a lawyer in Pittsburgh." A brief pause. "I grew up with documents on the dinner table. I know what fraud looks like. I've seen it tried before." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't the agency mention any of this?" "I suspect," she said carefully, "they didn't think it was relevant to a housekeeping position." He turned to look at her again, and this time held her gaze for a long moment. "You knew," he said slowly, "about the interference with the original candidate. You figured it out before you even got to the platform." She didn't look away. "I suspected it. The wire the agency received canceling the original placement came from the Blackstone Telegraph office, not from you. They showed it to me before I left Philadelphia. They thought it was simply an error. I thought it was something else." "And you came anyway?" A small silence. "I came anyway," she said. He thought about asking why. He decided not to. Some answers don't get better for being pushed at too quickly. The ranch house appeared out of the dark as they came over the last rise, low, solid, lit from within by firelight that old Denny had kept going. It looked small against the landscape. It looked like a thing that was trying to hold on. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. Lydia stirred, murmured something, pressed closer to the warmth beside her without waking. "One more thing you should know," Silas said. He wasn't looking at her now. He was looking at the house. "I haven't asked for help in a long time. I'm not good at it. I'll probably be hard to work with sometimes. I'll probably say the wrong thing more than once." A pause. "I'm telling you now because I think you deserve to know what you're walking into." Naomi looked at the house too. Then she said, "I've dealt with 30 children at once, Mr. Rowan. I believe I can manage one rancher." He almost said something. Instead, he got down from the wagon and reached up for his daughter, lifting her without waking her, the way you learn to do when you've been a parent long enough. And Naomi Prescott climbed down on her own, picked up her bag, and walked toward the door of the house, not hesitating, not slowing, moving forward like a woman who had decided long before tonight where she was going. Inside the walls of that small house, the fire kept burning. And somewhere 6 miles east, in a large house with large ambitions and a patience that was almost finished, Victor Crow sat at his desk and looked at the telegram that had just arrived. The agency had sent someone after all. He folded the paper slowly. That was a problem. But it was nothing, he told himself, that couldn't be fixed. The woman had no legal standing on that ranch. She was hired help. She was a stranger from the east with good gloves and no roots. He would handle it. He was good at handling things. What Victor Crow didn't understand, what he was not built to understand, was that the most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one who looks the most powerful. It's the one nobody thought to worry about. The one standing quietly in the corner, counting the exits, reading the room, doing the math that everyone else has stopped trying to do. He didn't know that yet. He would. The fire had burned low by the time Naomi found the kitchen. She hadn't slept. She'd tried, lying on the narrow cot in the small room off the main hallway that Silas had shown her with a minimum of words and a lamp he'd handed over without quite meeting her eyes. The room was clean enough. Someone had swept it recently, probably old Denny, who she'd met briefly at the door, a weathered man in his 60s who'd looked at her with the particular expression of someone trying very hard not to form an opinion. But the cot was short, and the wall let in cold through a gap near the floor that someone had stuffed with rags but not fixed. She'd lain there and listened to the house breathe and thought about what Silas had told her on the ride in. 6 weeks. Victor Crow had 6 weeks to build his case, which meant she had 6 weeks to understand exactly what she'd walked into. She got up at 4 in the morning, found her way to the kitchen by feel and firelight, and started going through the cupboards. It wasn't snooping. Or it was, but not the kind anyone could reasonably object to. She needed to know what was here, what they had, what they were missing, what the real situation looked like stripped of whatever dignity Silas Rowan was still managing to hold around it. In her experience, you could tell almost everything about a household's actual state of affairs by standing in its kitchen in the dark and looking at what was on the shelves. What was on these shelves told a hard story. There was flour, not enough. Salt pork, not much. A tin of coffee down to its last third. Dried beans, oats, a small cache of root vegetables that wouldn't last another 3 weeks at reasonable use. No preserves at all, which meant no one had put anything up for winter, which in October in Wyoming was not a small problem. It was the kind of problem that didn't announce itself all at once, but arrived slowly, like water through a cracked foundation, cold and persistent and eventually fatal to everything you were trying to keep warm. She stood in the kitchen with a lamp in her hand and thought, he didn't just lose his wife, he lost the person who knew how to run this. That was different from what she'd expected. She'd expected grief and isolation, and a man who'd let things slide. She hadn't expected the specific, practical shape of what happened when a frontier household lost the person who held its knowledge. All the invisible work, the knowing when to put things up, when to stretch supplies, when to mend before the mending became replacement, when to plan 3 months ahead because 3 months ahead was the only way to survive out here. Silas Rowan was not a careless man. She could see that. He'd kept the structural things going, the livestock, the water, the basic function of the ranch. But the interior workings of the house had been failing quietly for over a year, and she suspected he hadn't noticed because he'd been too busy keeping the outside from collapsing to look at what was happening inside. She set the lamp down and started making a list in her head. By the time the sky went from black to gray, she had a fire going, a pot of oats on, and had found, in a wooden crate under the side table, 3 jars of preserved plums that someone had put up the previous year and apparently forgotten. Small victories. She lined them up on the counter like evidence. She heard him before she saw him. Heavy boots on the wooden floor, the particular sound of a large man trying to move quietly in a small space. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in work clothes, hair not yet sorted, and stopped when he saw her. He looked at the fire, the pot, the 3 jars of plums. "You've been up a while," he said. "Since 4. He came in, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd found and refilled without comment, and stood at the window looking out at the gray light coming up over the hills. "Kitchen inventory," she said. "You're short on several things. Do you have an account at the general store in Blackstone?" A pause. "I have a running account, yes." "What's the balance?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She didn't press it. She said, "The plums were under the side table. Did you know they were there?" "Eleanor put them up the summer before she died." He said the name flatly, not coldly, just the way you say a word when you've had to practice keeping it neutral. "I forgot they were there." Naomi looked at the jars. "They're still good. I'll use them carefully." She paused. "How much do you know about Eleanor's system? how she managed the household supplies. He turned from the window. The look on his face was the look of a man who had never been asked that question and was realizing, possibly for the first time, that it was a question with a real answer. "Not enough," he said. "She kept it in her head mostly, some in a notebook." He stopped. "Is the notebook still here?" A longer pause. "Somewhere. She had a box of things. I put it in the back room after she died. I haven't—" He stopped again. "It's all right," Naomi said, not gently exactly, more matter-of-factly. "We don't need it right now. I can work out what I need to know by looking, but when you have time, it would help to go through that box." He nodded once and looked back out the window. "Denny will need me at the barn in 20 minutes. 2 of the fence posts on the north line need replacing before the first hard freeze. I'll have breakfast ready before you go." He looked at her then, a quick, sharp look that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite surprise, but was something between the two. Then he just nodded again and took his coffee toward the back door. Lydia appeared in the doorway he'd just vacated, small and sleep-rumpled, with her dark hair going in 3 directions at once, holding a cloth rabbit that was missing one ear. "Is that plums?" she said, looking at the jars. "It is. Mama made those." Naomi looked at the child carefully. "She did. They're very good ones. I can tell just by looking." Lydia came into the kitchen and climbed onto one of the chairs with the effortless confidence of a child who knew every piece of furniture in the house. She put the cloth rabbit on the table and looked at Naomi with those wide, measuring eyes. "Are you going to leave?" she asked. "The other one did." Naomi turned from the stove. "What other one?" "The woman before? Mrs. Lydia's forehead scrunched. She had red hair. She came in September. She left after 4 days. A pause. "She said the wind was too much." Naomi hadn't known about this one. The agency hadn't mentioned a previous candidate after Mrs. Calloway. She kept her expression even. "I'm not going anywhere, Lydia." "Papa says people say that." "Then I won't say it. I'll just stay, and you'll see." Lydia looked at her for a long moment with the particular unsettling assessment of a child who has learned, too early, that adults lie about staying. Then she picked up her rabbit and set it facing the window for reasons of its own. "I'm hungry," she announced. "Good," said Naomi. "Sit down." The first week was an education in what the word hard actually meant, stripped of abstraction. Naomi had told Silas she wasn't afraid of hard, and she'd meant it, but there was a difference between not being afraid of a thing and fully understanding what the thing was. In 8 years of teaching school in Pennsylvania, hard had meant 30 children in November, with one stove that didn't draw right and a roof that leaked when the snow melted. Hard had meant parents who didn't care, and school boards that cared about the wrong things, and students who needed more than she could give in 6 hours a day. That was hard. This was a different language that used the same word. The cold on the Wyoming frontier in October wasn't like Eastern cold. It had a physical intention to it, a directness, like it was specifically interested in you. It found the gap in your coat sleeve. It came up from the ground through your boots. It made the morning chores which started before full light and involved water that had to be hauled and stock that had to be fed and a wood supply that needed constant management, feel like arguments that had to be won before the day could even properly begin. She lost that argument on the 3rd morning. She'd gone to haul water from the pump, and the bucket had slipped from hands that hadn't yet recovered their grip in the cold. And she'd gone down on one knee in the mud, and the water had gone everywhere, and she'd knelt there for a moment, just a moment, with cold mud soaking through her skirt and the wind taking her breath, and she'd thought, this is the moment the red-haired woman went inside and started packing. Then she got up, refilled the bucket, and went back to the house. She told no one, not because she was proud, but because it wasn't worth mentioning. You fell down. You got up. The wind wasn't interested in your feelings about it. What she discovered, in those first days, was that the ranch itself was full of small, fixable things that nobody had had time to fix. The broken chair in the main room she repaired with a dowel and wood glue she found in the barn on the 3rd day. The rag-stuffed gap in her own wall she filled properly with wadded cloth soaked in tallow. The kitchen shelf that tilted at a 20-degree angle and sent things sliding, she re-leveled with a wedge of wood split from a piece of firewood. None of these were large things, but in a house that had been running on survival mode for over a year, The accumulation of small broken things had a weight to it, a draining quality, like noise you couldn't quite hear but could feel. When she fixed the shelf, Lydia watched her from across the room with the rabbit and said nothing. But at dinner that night she said, "The shelf doesn't tip anymore," to her father in a conversational tone. And Silas had looked up from his plate and across the room at the shelf, and something in his face had shifted almost imperceptibly. He didn't say anything to Naomi directly, but the next morning, without comment, he'd brought in a second load of firewood without being asked. It was, she understood, his version of thank you. Old Denny was the variable she hadn't accounted for. He wasn't hostile exactly. He'd been on the Rowan Ranch for 11 years and had watched the household change and then collapse and then struggle. And he'd developed the way old men sometimes did when they'd seen enough loss, a kind of protective skepticism toward anything new that was also anything hopeful. He didn't want to watch Silas get attached to something that was going to leave. He didn't want to watch Lydia get attached to something that was going to leave. He'd seen that already, and the red-haired woman in September had confirmed what he suspected. The Eastern women didn't stay. He made this clear not through words, but through the specific quality of his silences when Naomi was present, through the way he answered her practical questions with the minimum possible information. Through the morning, she asked him about the condition of the fence line, and he'd said simply, "It's a fence," and walked away. She'd let it sit for 3 days. Then, on the 4th day, she brought him coffee out to the barn where he was working alone, set it on the post beside him without a word, and went back to the house. She did it the next morning too, and the morning after that. On the 7th morning, he picked the coffee up before she'd turned to leave and said to the wall, "South fence has 3 more posts that won't make it to spring. Silas knows, but he's been putting it off." "How long to replace them?" she said. 2-3 days if the ground hasn't started freezing hard." "Has it?" A pause. "Not yet." "Then it should be done this week," she said. Old Denny didn't turn around, but she heard beneath his breath something that might have been agreement. It was Victor Crow's man who appeared on the 12th day. He came in the mid-morning, which was deliberate. He'd timed it for when Silas would be out on the range, which meant someone had been watching, which meant they'd been watching for a while. He was a young man, well-dressed for Blackstone, with a manner that had been trained to seem polite while communicating threat. He knocked on the door, which was more than Victor himself would have done, and when Naomi answered it, he looked at her with visible surprise that he covered quickly. "I'm looking for Silas Rowan," he said. "He's not here right now. Can I help you?" The man looked at her for a moment, cataloging, calculating, the way people did when they were trying to figure out what category you fit in. "And you are?" "Naomi Prescott. I work for Mr. Rowan." She kept her hands still at her sides. "Who are you?" "James Aldrich. I'm Mr. Crow's legal representative." He produced from inside his coat a folded document. "I have some papers Mr. Rowan should be aware of, pertaining to a property survey conducted last month on the western boundary." Naomi looked at the document without touching it. "Mr. Rowan will be back by late afternoon. You're welcome to return then. I'll leave the papers with you. I don't have authority to receive legal documents on his behalf." A small smile, not warm. "They're not legal documents, just information, survey results. Mr. Crow thought it neighborly to share them in advance of any formal proceedings." "How considerate of Mr. Crow," she said, in a tone that was perfectly neutral. "I'll let Mr. Rowan know you came by, Mr. Aldrich." She closed the door, then she stood with her back to it, breathing evenly, and listened to his footsteps cross the porch and go down to where his horse was tied. She moved to the side window and watched him ride east, back toward Victor Crow's land, and noted, because she noted things, that he paused once at the ridge and looked back at the house before going over. Formal proceedings. Not a threat, but an announcement. Not a question, but a notification that the question had already been decided. She was still standing at the window when Lydia appeared at her elbow. "Who was that man?" "Someone who works for Mr. Crow." "I don't like Mr. Crow," Lydia said, with the directness of a child who hasn't yet learned to soften true things. "He looks at our creek like it's already his." Naomi looked down at her. "Has he come here before?" "Twice. Before Mama died and once after. Papa made him leave the second time." She paused, pressing her rabbit to her chest. "He was smiling when he left. That was the part that scared me." Naomi looked back out the window at the empty ridge. "Smart girl," she said quietly. When Silas came in that evening, she told him about the visitor before he'd even taken off his coat. She gave him every detail in the order it happened, without editorializing, the same way she'd learned to report things to a school board when you needed them to hear the facts before their assumptions got in the way. He listened without interrupting. His face went through something while she spoke, not panic, not anger exactly, more like the look of a man who has been expecting a blow and now knows the direction it's coming from. He called it a survey, she said. Crow hired a surveyor in August. I heard about it in town. People said it was for his northern property. His jaw was set. It wasn't. No, it wasn't. She paused. Silas, do you have your original land grant? The survey documents from when your family filed the claim? I have them, in the strongbox in my room. We need to look at them together, tonight, if you can. She met his eyes. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Something moved in his expression, a recognition, maybe, of what she already understood about the timeline they were working inside. He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight of the main room, with Lydia already asleep in the back, and old Denny long gone to the bunkhouse, and she saw him recalibrate something, not about the situation, about her. You know what he's planning, Silas said. I know the shape of it. I need the documents to know the details. She kept her voice steady. This isn't the first time I've watched someone use a fraudulent survey to take something that wasn't theirs. My father spent 2 years fighting a case like this for a family in our county. They lost because they waited too long to understand what was actually being contested. Silas was quiet. The fire cracked. Did your father win the cases he took? Not always, she said. But the ones he lost, he always knew why afterward. The ones where other people lost without fighting, they never did. She paused. There's a difference between losing a fair fight and losing because you didn't know you were in one. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pushed back from where he'd been leaning against the wall and said, Give me a minute. He came back with a flat metal strongbox and set it on the table between them. What they found inside took them 2 hours to work through, sitting on opposite sides of the table with the lamp burning between them, and Naomi making careful notes on a sheet of paper she'd found in her bag. Silas watched her read the documents with the focused stillness of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last hour, to trust someone he didn't entirely know yet. It wasn't comfortable for him, she could tell. But he did it anyway, and that told her something about him she hadn't been sure of before. The original land grant was solid. The survey marks were precise, and the witness signatures were legitimate. She knew enough from her father's work to recognize authentic documentation from the period. The western boundary, the one that included the creek, was established in 1871 and had been confirmed twice since then. But there was a problem. Here, she said, pointing to a line in the 1871 survey. The reference marker for the western boundary. It's tied to a stone formation called, she squinted at the handwriting, Deller's Rock. I know it, Silas said, on the ridge above the creek bend. Does it still look the same as it did in 1871? A silence. Part of it came down in a rock slide about 5 years ago, he said slowly. Big section of the western face. Naomi looked at him. That's the angle, she said. That's how they'll do it. If the reference marker has changed sufficiently, they'll argue the original survey is void and the boundary requires reestablishment, and their new survey, conducted by their own hired man, will establish the boundary in a very different place. Silas stared at the documents. Can they do that? If the court accepts the argument, yes, it's been done before. She turned the paper toward him. What they're counting on is that you won't be able to produce evidence of where the original marker was and what it looked like. That without the physical reference point, your boundary description becomes contested and their version becomes the only version with a recent survey to back it. So we need evidence of what Deller's Rock looked like before the slide. We need evidence that the rock still exists in a form consistent with the original survey description, or we need witness testimony from people who were present at the original marking. She paused. How long has old Denny been on the property? Silas looked up. Something moved behind his eyes, slow at first, then faster. 11 years. Was he here in 1871? No, but... He stopped. My father's foreman was. Walt Greer. He's in his 70s now, lives in Casper. Is he trustworthy? Completely. Then that's where we start. She made a note. And we need someone to look at Deller's rock itself. Someone who can testify about its current condition and its relationship to the original survey description. She looked up at him. Do you know any surveyors who aren't in Victor Crow's pocket? He almost smiled. Not quite. That's a shorter list than it should be. But there's a man in Cheyenne, Jack Aldrin, not related to Crow's lawyer. I went to school with his older brother. He's honest. Write to him tomorrow. First thing. Silas looked at her across the lamp and the documents and the history of everything he'd built or inherited or fought to keep, and said, Naomi, you came here to cook and keep house. I came here because someone tried to stop me from coming here, she said simply, which told me this was somewhere I needed to be. She began sorting the documents carefully back into their order. I'm still going to cook. Lydia still needs meals, and so do you, and so does Denny. And the kitchen shelf that was tilting is now level, and I found the plums Eleanor put up, and the fence posts on the south line need to be done before the ground freezes. She set the stack of papers square on the table. None of that changes because we also have a legal problem. It just means we have more to do. Silas was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, the wind had picked up and was testing the corners of the house the way the wind out here always eventually did, looking for weakness, pushing on anything that might give. She would have liked you, he said. It came out quietly, not looking at her, looking at the papers. Eleanor, she would have... He stopped himself, cleared his throat. That's all I'll say about that. Naomi nodded. She understood what the sentence was and wasn't, what it cost a man like him to say even that much. She began to gather her notes. Get some sleep. I'll be up at 4. You don't have to... The oats are better when they've had time. She picked up her lamp. And Lydia likes them with the plums. It gives her something to look forward to in the morning. She paused at the doorway. Silas, we have 6 weeks. That's enough time, but only if we use it. She went to her room. He sat alone at the table for another 10 minutes, looking at the strongbox, looking at the window where the dark pressed against the glass. Then he stood, put the strongbox away, and went to the front door and checked the latch the way he did every night. A habit, a small act of keeping the outside outside. He stood there a moment with his hand on the latch and listened to the house. It sounded different than it had 2 weeks ago. He couldn't have said how exactly. Just different. Fuller, maybe. Less like something that was waiting to stop, and more like something that was still going. He went to bed. At the eastern edge of the county, the lamp was still burning in Victor Crow's study. James Aldrich had returned that afternoon with his report. The woman had answered the door, had taken nothing, had closed the door quietly. Crow had listened to this and then asked a question that Aldrich hadn't expected. Did she seem frightened? Aldrich had thought about it. No, sir. Crow had turned back to his desk. Find out who she is, he said. Find out everything. Aldrich had started to leave. James? Crow hadn't looked up. Do it quickly. Something in his voice was different than usual. Not louder, quieter. Which was, to people who knew Victor Crow well, the more concerning version. Aldrich moved quickly. The letter to Jack Aldrin in Cheyenne went out the next morning with the post rider, and after that there was nothing to do but wait and work, which on a frontier ranch in late October meant there was never actually nothing to do. Naomi learned this the way you learn most true things. Not by being told, but by living inside it until it stopped feeling strange. The days had a structure that was less like a schedule and more like a physical law. You got up before light, because the animals didn't care about light. You hauled water and fed stock and got the fire going and started breakfast and swept and mended and then started on whatever the day's particular problem was, and by the time you'd finished the day's particular problem, there were 3 more that had appeared behind it, patient and unimpressed, waiting their turn. She stopped wearing her good gloves by the end of the 2nd week. They were in the bottom of her trunk and she didn't miss them. What she hadn't expected, what no one had told her and she hadn't thought to anticipate, was Lydia. The child was not easy. Naomi had taught school for 8 years, and she knew the difference between a child who was difficult and a child who was damaged in ways that showed up sideways, and Lydia was the second kind. She was not a bad child. She was a child who had watched her mother die slowly over 6 weeks the previous summer, who had then watched her father go somewhere behind his eyes that he hadn't quite come back from, who had then watched 2 women arrive at the ranch and leave within days, who had learned with the terrible efficiency of a small person with no other options that the safest thing was to love carefully and provisionally, with one hand always ready to take it back. She tested Naomi in the specific ways a grieving 5-year-old could test someone. She asked for things and then didn't want them. She was sunny and cooperative for 3 days in a row, and then woke up one morning in a darkness that had nothing to do with weather and refused to eat and sat in the corner with her rabbit and stared at nothing. She asked twice in the first 3 weeks whether Naomi was going to die. The first time, Naomi had answered carefully and honestly, that she didn't plan to, that she was healthy, that dying wasn't something she was expecting. Lydia had nodded and gone back to whatever she was doing, and Naomi had stood in the kitchen afterward with a feeling in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. The second time, Naomi had put down what she was doing, sat on the floor next to Lydia, because the child was on the floor, and said, "I'm not going anywhere. I know you've heard that before, so I won't ask you to believe it. Just watch and see." Lydia had looked at her for a long time. "That's what you said the first time," she said, "on the platform." "I know, and I'm still here." Another long look. Then Lydia had leaned sideways and put her head against Naomi's arm. Not quite a hug, just contact, the way a child does when they're not ready to commit to something but need to be near it anyway. Naomi had sat very still and let her. Silas had walked in from outside 2 minutes later, seen them on the floor, and gone very quiet in that way he had. The way that meant something was happening inside him that he wasn't going to talk about yet. He'd hung up his coat and said, "Supper ready?" 20 minutes, Naomi had said. And that was that. Except it wasn't, and all three of them knew it. The reply from Jack Aldrin came faster than Naomi had expected, 9 days after they'd sent the letter, which meant he'd answered the same day it arrived. The letter was 2 pages, direct and careful, and Naomi read it twice at the kitchen table before bringing it to Silas. Aldrin knew Victor Crow's hired surveyor. His name was Purvis, and he had a reputation in Cheyenne that was specific and not flattering. A man who produced accurate surveys when accuracy served his client, and creative surveys when it didn't. He'd been involved in 2 previous boundary disputes in the territory, both of which had been settled before reaching the court that would have examined his methodology. Aldrin wrote, "I cannot say with certainty that his work on your western boundary is fraudulent, but I can say that I would not accept his measurements without independent verification, and I think you would be wise to seek the same." He was willing to come. He named a fee that was significant but not impossible, and a timeline. He could be in Blackstone within 2 weeks if Silas confirmed. Silas read the letter standing up, which was how he read most things, and when he finished, he folded it and held it for a moment. 2 weeks, he said. "It gives us a week to spare before the circuit judge arrives," Naomi said. "If Crow files before Aldrin gets here, we'll need to request a delay, and delays in a circuit court session are not easy to get, I know." He set the letter on the table. "The money. Is there enough?" A pause. "It'll leave us thin." Thinner than losing the creek? He looked at her with that expression she'd come to recognize, half irritated, half something else. The expression of a man who appreciated directness and was still slightly surprised every time it appeared. "No," he said, "not thinner than that." "Then write to him tonight." He did. It was 3 days later that Naomi found out what Crow had learned about her. She'd gone into Blackstone with old Denny on the supply run, the first time she'd been back to town since arriving. She had a list and a careful calculation of what the account could carry and what needed to wait, and she went through the general store methodically while Denny loaded the wagon outside. The store owner, a broad-faced man named Garrett, had been polite enough to her face. It was on her way out, when she passed close enough to the 2 men near the door to overhear without being noticed, that she caught it. Crow's man was asking around. Apparently she's not just a housekeeper, used to work with her father, some kind of land clerk or records keeper back east. The voice was low, casually dismissive. Crow's not worried, says she's got no legal standing on that property. Whatever she knows doesn't matter if she can't stand up in court. The second man said something she didn't catch. The first one replied, "What's Silas gonna do? Marry her?" She pushed through the door before they finished, walking into the cold air of the street without stopping. She stood by the wagon for a moment, looking at nothing, her list folded in her hands. No legal standing. She'd known this. She'd known it from the beginning, technically. Known it the way you know a fact that hasn't yet connected to its full consequence. She was an employee. She had no property rights, no standing to testify on behalf of the ranch's ownership, no legal authority to act as anything other than hired help in a household that wasn't hers. Whatever she knew didn't matter if she couldn't stand in court. Old Denny came around the side of the wagon, saw her face, and stopped. He looked at her with those weathered eyes that had seen more than he usually admitted to, and said, "You heard something." "In the store." She kept her voice level. "Crow knows who I am. His people have been asking around." Denny was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does Silas know about the standing problem?" She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, which told her he'd already thought about this himself. He knows I'm an employee," she said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet. "I'm not a fool," Denny said, not unkindly. "I've been on that ranch 11 years. I've watched Crow work before. He doesn't just come at a thing straight. He finds the wall and he pushes until he finds where it's weak." He paused. "You're the strongest thing on that property right now, which means you're also where he's going to push." She looked down at the list in her hands. "Tell him I need to speak with him tonight," she said, "when Lydia's asleep." Denny nodded once and climbed up to the wagon seat without another word. The conversation happened at 9 o'clock, at the same table where they'd worked through the land documents 3 weeks before. Lydia had been asleep for an hour. The fire was steady. Naomi told Silas what she'd heard in the store, all of it, without pausing to manage how it landed. He listened with his arms on the table and his eyes on her face, and when she finished, he was silent for a moment that was longer than most of his silences. "He's right," Silas said, "about the standing. I know. If Aldrin comes and confirms the boundary fraud, we can challenge Purvis's survey. But the challenge still has to be made by someone with legal standing in the property." He paused. "Me. It has to be me making the case." "Yes. So the question is whether I have enough to stand on without you being able to—" He stopped. Started again differently. "The question is what Crow does if he figures out that the only person who fully understands the legal strategy is someone he can neutralize by simply pointing out she has no authority here." "He's already figured that out," Naomi said. "That's what the men in the store were telling each other." Silas got up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there for a minute with his back to her, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way a man holds himself when he's trying to think through something, and the thinking is pulling in directions that aren't comfortable. "There's a solution," he said, not turning around. "You know there's a solution." "I know what you're thinking," she said carefully, "and I want to be honest with you about it, Silas. What I know about the law and the documents in Crow's strategy, that exists regardless of my legal standing. It doesn't disappear. You can understand it well enough to present it yourself with Aldrin's help." "Can I?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of flat statement that was also a question, honest in the way that was harder to say than confidence would have been. "You're not a fool," she said. You understand the substance of what I've told you. I understand it when you explain it. That's different from understanding it myself." He turned around. "And Crow has a lawyer. A good one. A man who does this for a living in front of judges." He looked at her directly. "I need someone on my side who can match that, who understands not just the facts but the way the argument moves. Your brother-in-law is in Kansas, and I haven't spoken to him in 2 years. He shook his head. "Even if I wired him tonight, there's no time." The room was quiet except for the fire and the wind. "I'm not asking you," Silas said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to ask you to do something that changes your situation here because we have a problem. That's not—" He stopped, frustrated with himself in the way people get when the words they need are hiding from them. "That's not a good enough reason." Naomi looked at him across the table, at the face of a man who had not asked for help in years, who was choosing his words with the particular care of someone who didn't want what he said to be misunderstood. "What would be a good enough reason?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in the lamplight made the angles of his face harder to read, or maybe just more honest. "I don't know yet," he said, "but not this." She nodded. She could respect that. What she didn't say, sitting there with the list from the store still in her coat pocket, and the sound of Lydia breathing in the back room and the wind doing its nightly inventory of every weak point in the walls. What she didn't say was that she'd been thinking about the standing problem since the platform. Since before the platform, since the moment she'd seen the wire in the agency office and understood that someone had tried to keep her from arriving. Someone who was afraid of what she might do if she got here. She'd thought about it, and she'd arrived at the same place every time, and she wasn't ready to say it yet because saying it would change things in ways that couldn't be changed back. And she needed to be sure. Not about the legal problem. About the other thing. The thing underneath the legal problem that was harder to be certain about. She'd watched Silas Rowan for 3 weeks. She'd watched him with his daughter, with his land, with old Denny, with the broken things around the house that he'd never quite stopped noticing even when he didn't have time to fix them. She'd watched him at the table with the documents, trusting her reading of things he couldn't fully read himself, and she'd watched him with Lydia on the nights the child had nightmares, and he sat outside her door in the dark until the sound stopped. She'd watched him be wrong about small things and correct himself without making a production of it. She'd watched him carry the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself, that just shows up in the way a person moves, the way they go quiet at certain hours. He was not an easy man. He'd said so himself, and he was right. But easy wasn't the same as good. She went to her room that night and lay awake for a long time thinking. Jack Aldrin arrived on a Tuesday, which was 11 days after Silas had confirmed the letter, which meant he'd left before the confirmation arrived, which meant he'd already decided he was coming before he'd been formally asked. He was a compact, serious man in his 40s who shook Silas's hand, nodded at Naomi with a look that said he'd already formed a thorough opinion of her from the correspondence and wasn't planning to revise it downward, and went directly to the table and asked to see the land grant. He spent 4 hours with the documents that first evening, asking occasional questions that were specific and answered precisely, and when he was done, he sat back and said, "The original survey is solid. Your boundary is clear. The problem is Deller's Rock." "I know," Silas said. "I need to see what's left of it. Tomorrow, if the weather holds." The weather held. The three of them rode to the western boundary the next morning, Naomi having insisted quietly on coming over a brief objection from Silas that died when he looked at her face and apparently reconsidered whether the objection was worth the energy. What was left of Deller's Rock was significant, but not what it had been. The western face had come down in the rock slide 5 years ago, leaving a different profile than the one described in the original survey documents. Not unrecognizable, the core formation was still there, the distinctive angle of the eastern face that the 1871 surveyor had used as his primary reference, but changed enough that a man arguing in front of a judge could make a case for ambiguity. Aldrin walked around the formation for 20 minutes without speaking. He pulled out his own instruments and took measurements. He made notes in a small leather book. Naomi watched him and watched the creek below, which ran clear and cold and constant over the stones, and thought about what it meant to a ranch, to life out here, to have one reliable thing that didn't run dry or freeze over or fail. "It's defensible," Aldrin said finally, coming back to where they stood. "The eastern face profile matches the description closely enough, but Purvis's survey will argue the western boundary reference is void because the marker as described no longer exists in its described form." He looked at Silas. "Do you have any photographs? Any drawings of the rock made before the slide?" "No." "What about the witnesses Naomi mentioned in the letter?" "The original foreman, Walt Greer. I sent him a letter the same day I wrote to you." Silas paused. "I haven't heard back." Aldrin looked at the rock for another moment, then at the creek, then out at the land around them. "I can produce a survey that establishes the current formation's relationship to the original description," he said. "It won't be airtight. Nothing is airtight when the physical marker has changed, but it will be credible, and it will be honest, which is more than Purvis can say about his." He looked at Naomi. "You said your father worked these cases for 20 years. Then you know the argument comes down to which surveyor the judge finds more credible. And which side has a better witness," she said. "That too." They rode back in a silence that was less uncomfortable than it might have been between strangers, because they weren't quite strangers anymore. Something about working through a serious problem together accelerated the kind of knowing that usually took much longer. It was on the ride back that the letter caught up with them. Old Denny met them on the road, coming from the direction of Blackstone with a letter in his hand and an expression that meant he'd been looking for them specifically. "Came with the Morning Post," he said, handing it to Silas. "Postmaster said it was urgent." That's his word, not mine. Silas opened it. Naomi watched his face. She'd learned to read his face in the same way you learn to read the weather out here. Not perfectly, but well enough to know when something serious was coming. His face said something serious was coming. He handed her the letter without a word. It was from Walt Greer. Not from Walt Greer himself, but from Walt Greer's daughter. Her father had been willing to come, had in fact been preparing to come, had spoken warmly of the Rowan family, and said he'd been waiting 20 years for someone to ask him to do exactly this. He had left for Blackstone 3 days ago, the daughter wrote. She had expected a letter from him by now. Instead, the previous evening, a man she didn't recognize had knocked on her door and told her that her father had fallen on the road and been taken to a doctor's house in a town she'd never heard of, and that he would be delayed and she shouldn't worry, and then had left before she could ask any questions. She was worried. She didn't know what to do. She was writing to Silas Rowan because her father had said to trust him. Naomi read the letter twice. When she looked up, Aldrin was watching her with sharp eyes, and Denny was watching the road east with an expression that had gone flat and careful. They knew about Greer, Naomi said. Yes, said Silas. His voice was completely level, which was his version of something far from level. They've been watching who you contact. She folded the letter. Which means they have someone watching the post. Or someone in the post office, Aldrin said quietly. Either way, Silas was looking at the road east, the same direction Denny was looking. If they've interfered with Walt, don't, Naomi said. Not sharply, just clearly. Don't go east yet. We don't know what's happened, and if you're gone when Crow makes his next move, he's an old man, Silas said, and his voice had cracked just slightly on the last word, just enough to hear it. I know. But right now we don't know where he is or what's happened, and going east without information puts you on the wrong road. She looked at him. Send Denny first. He travels faster, he's less visible, and he knows the territory between here and Greer's place better than anyone. Denny, without being asked, was already nodding. Silas looked at her, then at Denny. Then he made the kind of decision that cost something, choosing strategy over instinct, the right move over the move that felt like action. Go tonight, he said to Denny. Take the bay. And Denny, the old man looked at him. Be careful. Denny left within the hour. That night the house was quieter than it had been in weeks. Lydia picked up on the tension the way children do, through some atmospheric sense that doesn't need words, and she was subdued at supper, pushing food around her plate and looking at Naomi with those dark eyes that always seemed to be asking a question she hadn't figured out how to put into words yet. After supper, while Aldrin went over his survey notes at the table, Lydia came and stood next to Naomi at the wash basin, very close, not touching, just near. Is Denny coming back? She asked. Of course he is. Is something bad happening? Naomi rinsed the plate in her hands and set it on the shelf. She thought about how to answer a 5-year-old's question about a bad thing that was happening, and decided the same thing she always decided with Lydia, which was that the truth, given carefully, was better than the kind of comfort that would need to be walked back later. Someone is trying to take our water, she said. The creek. Mr. Crow wants it. Lydia was quiet. Can he take it? Not if we stop him. Are we going to stop him? We're going to try. Another silence. Lydia picked up the next plate and handed it to Naomi with the matter-of-fact helpfulness she'd started showing in the last week, small and unprompted, handing things over without being asked, appearing at the right moment with the right object, as if she'd decided on some internal level to make herself useful in whatever way her 5-year-old hands could manage. Naomi, she said, if we stop him, are you going to stay after? Naomi looked at the child next to her, small and serious and carrying more than any small person should have to carry, and felt something settle in her own chest. Not a decision, because it wasn't exactly a decision anymore. It was more like the recognition of something she'd already known. Yes, she said. I'm going to stay. Lydia nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd calculated for herself and found satisfactory. She handed over the last plate and then went to get her rabbit from the table, and the kitchen was quiet, and Aldrin's pen scratched steadily across paper, and from the other room came the sound of Silas doing whatever Silas did in the evenings when he thought no one was paying attention, which was, Naomi had learned, mostly nothing, mostly just standing somewhere quiet, holding all of it. She dried her hands. 40 miles east on a road that was dark and cold and longer than it looked on any map, old Denny rode through the night with his hat low and the bay horse breathing steady underneath him, looking for an old man who knew where the boundary was. And in Victor Crow's study, James Aldrich set a report on the desk and said, "She knows about the survey strategy. She's known since the beginning." Crow read the report without expression. Then he set it down. "What about Greer?" "Delayed. He won't make it in time." "And the surveyor she's brought in?" "Aldrin. He's honest." Aldrich paused. "Which means he'll produce a credible counter-survey." Crow was quiet for a moment. Then, "It doesn't matter what she knows or what Aldrin produces. She has no standing. The ranch belongs to Rowan. A schoolteacher from Pennsylvania has no authority to argue anything in front of a circuit judge." He picked up his pen. "Unless that changes." Aldrich said nothing. He understood what Crow meant. He also understood, and did not say, that the woman in the Rowan household had been 3 moves ahead of them since before she'd arrived in Blackstone, and that the very thing Crow was now banking on might also be the thing she'd already considered. Outside the window, the wind came down from the north with the first real warning of what winter intended. Denny came back on the 3rd day. He rode in before breakfast, the bay horse tired but steady, and Naomi heard the hooves on the frozen ground from the kitchen and had coffee poured before he'd finished tying the horse at the post. She brought it to the door, and he took it without a word, which was how she knew the news wasn't simple. Silas appeared from the barn within 2 minutes. He'd heard the horse too. They stood on the porch in the early cold, Denny with his coffee and his 3 days of road on him, and he told them what he'd found. Walt Greer had not fallen on the road. Walt Greer had been met on the road by 2 men who'd told him, with the particular politeness that is really a threat wearing a coat, that an old man with old bones had no business making a long journey in October, that accidents happened on frontier roads, that his daughter would miss him if something went wrong. They had not touched him. They had not needed to. They had said what they came to say and ridden east, back toward Crow's Land, and Walt Greer had sat on his horse in the middle of the road for a long time before turning around. Denny had found him at home, sitting in his kitchen with his daughter, hovering and his hands around a cup of something hot, and his face carrying the particular expression of a man who is ashamed of a decision he also knows was the right one. "He's sorry," Denny said. "He said to tell Silas he's sorry. He wanted to come." "Is he all right?" Naomi asked. "Shaken. Not hurt." Denny looked at his coffee. "He's 73 years old and he lives alone except for his daughter, and he doesn't have anyone who can—" He stopped. "He's sorry." Silas had his jaw set in the brick wall way, but underneath it something else was happening that Naomi could read now after 5 weeks of watching his face. He wasn't angry at Walt Greer. He was angry at the thing that had made an old man feel he had to choose between his safety and his loyalty. "They threatened him," Silas said. "Yes." "Which means they knew about him before I'd even written the letter." His voice was flat. "They've had someone watching the ranch, watching what we do, who we contact." "Watching the mail," Naomi said. "We knew that already. But this confirms it." She looked at Denny. "Did Greer say anything about what he saw on the road? The 2 men. Did he recognize them?" "One of them. He said one was a man named Colton who works Crow's North property. The other he didn't know." "Colton." Silas said the name with recognition that had some history in it. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's been with Crow 4 years. Does the kind of work Crow doesn't want his lawyers to know about." He paused. "This is a problem." "I know," Naomi said. "Without Greer, I know." She was already thinking, had been thinking, since the moment Denny's horse appeared on the road. She'd been turning the problem over since the night they'd gotten the daughter's letter, and in 3 days she'd arrived at one thing. Not a solution exactly, more like a different way to look at what they had. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. Aldrin's already up." The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table while Lydia was still asleep, which was something Naomi had timed deliberately. The child didn't need to hear this particular conversation. Naomi had the land documents out. She'd been through them again the night before, and the night before that, and she'd found something on the second reading that she'd overlooked on the first, the way you sometimes read a word wrong 10 times, and then suddenly see it correctly and wonder how you missed it. "The 1871 survey," she said. "The witness signatures." Aldrin leaned forward. He'd already spent more time with these documents than anyone, but he was the kind of man who understood that someone else could see something he hadn't. "There are 3, she continued. "The surveyor himself, a man named Thomas Hale, who is presumably long dead. a county official whose signature I can't read clearly, and a third. She turned the document so they could see. Joseph Marvel, rancher. His property marker is listed as the Marvel Homestead, Eastern Blackstone County. Silence. Marvel, Denny said. Pete Marvel's grandfather, Silas said slowly. Joseph would have been Pete's father's father. He settled the homestead in the late 1860s. Is Pete Marvel still on that property? He is. Third generation. He's 40-something, lives about 7 miles east of us. Silas looked at the document. His grandfather witnessed the original survey, which means Pete Marvel may have heard about it. Not direct testimony. It's not what Walt Greer would have given us. But Joseph Marvel's presence as a witness is documented, and if Pete has any of his grandfather's papers, any letters, any journal, anything that references the boundary marking. She paused. It's not as strong as Greer, but it's something. And it's something Crow can't have anticipated because it's not a person they would have thought to watch for. Aldrin had picked up the document and was examining it with his magnifying glass. It would need to be corroborating evidence to my survey. It won't stand alone. But if I can produce a credible counter-survey and Pete Marvel can produce any documentation from his grandfather, he set the glass down. It strengthens the case considerably. Can you approach Marvel? Naomi asked Silas. Pete and I aren't close, but we're not enemies. He's a reasonable man. He paused. Crow offered to buy his water rights 2 years ago. He refused. Then he already knows what Crow is. Most people in this county know what Crow is, Denny said, without inflection. Knowing it and being willing to step up are different things. I know, Naomi said, but it's worth asking. Silas looked at her across the table. There was something in his expression she'd been seeing more frequently in the last week. A settling, almost. Like a man who had spent a long time carrying something alone and was slowly, reluctantly, learning what it felt like to put some of the weight down. I'll ride out to Marvel's today, he said. Take Aldrin, she said. Let him explain the survey angle directly. Pete Marvel will understand what's being asked if he hears it from another man who knows land. Silas considered this, then nodded. He looked at Aldrin. You willing? That's why I'm here, Aldrin said simply. They left after breakfast. Naomi stood on the porch and watched them go, and then went back inside to the work that didn't stop because there was a crisis. The fire, the water, the mending, Lydia's mourning, all of it proceeding with the indifference of daily life to the things happening around it. Lydia was quiet that morning. She helped without being asked, which she'd been doing more consistently, and at one point, while Naomi was working through the mending pile, she climbed onto the chair across from her and said, Are they going to get help? They're going to ask for it, Naomi said. Whether they get it depends on Pete Marvel. I know Pete Marvel. He has a brown dog named Horatio. That's good to know. Lydia picked at a loose thread on the table. Naomi, if we lose the creek, what happens? Naomi set down the shirt she was mending. She thought about how to answer honestly without loading more weight onto a child who was already carrying too much. The ranch becomes very hard to keep, she said. Maybe impossible. And then what? Then we'd have to figure out what comes next. She picked up the shirt again. But we haven't lost yet, so we don't need to figure that out yet. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then, I don't want to leave. I know. This is where Mama is. The child stopped, looked at the wall. She's in the garden, in the corner where she used to sit. I know she's not there, but that's where I feel her. Naomi put the shirt down again. She looked at Lydia, the small person with her cloth rabbit and her father's serious eyes and her mother's memory written into every corner of a house that was also supposed to be her future, and she thought, this is what we're actually fighting for. Not the creek, not the land grant. This child's right to feel her mother in the corner of a garden. We're not leaving, Naomi said. Not if I have anything to do with it. Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the rabbit and put it on the table facing the window, which was, Naomi had learned, Lydia's version of agreement. Silas and Aldrin came back in the late afternoon with Pete Marvel between them. He was a stocky, quiet man with a full beard going gray at the edges and the look of someone who took his time deciding things and then decided them completely. He shook Naomi's hand at the door with a grip that was firm without performing, looked around the main room with the evaluating eye of a man who spent his life maintaining things, and sat down at the table when invited. Your grandfather's papers, Naomi said, after the basics had been covered. after Aldrin had laid out the survey situation and Silas had explained the timeline. Did he keep records? Letters, journals, anything from the early settlement period? Pete Marvel looked at the table for a moment. My grandfather was a meticulous man, he said. Kept a journal his whole life, 50 years of journals, give or take. They're in a trunk in my back room. He paused. I haven't read most of them. Would you be willing to look? Specifically for any entry from 1871 referencing the boundary survey on the Rowan property. If he was present as a witness, he may have written about it. Pete was quiet for a moment that was longer than comfortable. Then he said, Crow sent a man to my place last spring, offered me good money for the water rights on my south boundary. I told him no. He looked at Silas. He came back in August with a higher number. I told him no again. He paused. Third time I didn't let him get to the number. I just said no and closed the door. He'll come back, Silas said. I know he'll come back. Pete looked at his hands. Man like that doesn't stop until there's a reason he has to. He looked up at Naomi. You think finding something in my grandfather's journal gives you that reason? I think it's part of it, she said. I think the full reason is a credible counter-survey, a documented witness chain, and a judge who can see that Crow's man produced a fraudulent document. She paused. It's not guaranteed, but it's a real chance. Pete Marvel was quiet for another moment. Then he stood up. I'll go through the journals tonight, he said. If there's anything, I'll send word tomorrow morning. Silas stood too and put his hand out, and Pete shook it with the solemnity of men who don't make commitments lightly. After he left, Silas stood in the main room and said nothing for a while. Aldrin had gone to his notes. Lydia was in the back with the rabbit. The house was in that particular end-of-day quiet that Naomi had come to recognize as the moment when the day let go and you were briefly in the space between what had happened and what came next. It's not enough, Silas said. He wasn't asking. He was stating the accounting of where they were. The journal may be enough to corroborate Aldrin's survey, Naomi said. Maybe? He looked at the wall, and the standing problem. She'd been waiting for him to come back to it. She'd known he would. It had been sitting between them since the night she'd told him what the men in Garrett's store had said, and they'd both been moving around it carefully, the way you move around something in the dark that you know is there but aren't ready to look at directly. Naomi. He said her name and then stopped, looking for what came next. She waited. He turned around. He looked at her in the lamplight with an expression that was several things at once. Not romantic, not what a person would write in a letter, nothing clean or easy. More like a man standing at the edge of something and deciding whether the ground on the other side would hold. I have a problem, he said, and I've been trying to figure out if there's a way around it that doesn't involve asking you to do something because I need it done. Because I don't want you to think that's why. Silas, she kept her voice even, say it plainly. If you were my wife, he said, you'd have legal standing to testify, to act on behalf of the property. He stopped. That's the legal fact. That's the practical problem and the practical solution, and I know it and you know it. He looked at her directly. What I don't know is how to ask that without it sounding like I'm asking you to do a legal maneuver. Are you asking me? She said. A long pause. I'm trying to figure out if I have the right to ask you, he said. We've known each other 5 weeks. I know. That's not enough time to... He stopped. Most people would say that's not enough time. Most people in this situation would have been on the first train east a month ago, she said. I don't think we're working with most people's timeline. He looked at her for a moment. She watched something move through his face, not resolve exactly, more like the settling of something that had been unsettled for a long time. I've been noticing things, he said. Since the first night. Not... He paused. I've been trying not to, because it seemed wrong to notice things when there were so many other things to deal with. I know, she said quietly. I've been doing the same. Another silence. The fire cracked. Lydia talks about you, he said. In the evenings, after you've gone to your room. She talks about things you said that day, things you showed her, things you'll be doing tomorrow. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. She talked about her mother like that. Naomi was quiet. I'm not saying that as I don't mean it as pressure, he said. I mean it as, I want you to know that I'm not asking because of the legal problem. I'm asking in spite of the legal problem. I'm asking because he stopped again, pressed his mouth together, tried a different angle. I'm asking because the house is different now than it was before you came. And not because the shelf is level or the kitchen stocked. Because of something I don't have a word for, that I had before Eleanor died and then didn't have, and now I can feel it coming back. And I don't know what to do with that except say it honestly and ask if you— Yes, Naomi said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. Yes, Silas. I'll marry you. He stood very still for a moment. She could see him taking it in, recalibrating, the way he did with information that was real and significant. Not fast, but completely. You should probably think about it more than— I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks, she said. I've been waiting for you to get there. A silence. And then something happened to his face that she hadn't seen before. Not a smile exactly, more like the thing that comes before a smile. The moment when the decision to stop guarding something makes the whole structure change. It lasted only a second before he put it away again, but she saw it. I'm not easy, he said. You've mentioned that. I mean it. I know you mean it. She looked at him. I'm not going to pretend this is simple, or that 5 weeks is a long time, or that we know everything about each other. We don't. We won't for years, probably. She paused. But I know enough. And I think you do too. He nodded once, slowly. The circuit judge will be here in 10 days for Crow's case. He can marry us first. That almost got the smile. Before he rules on whether I own my own land. Efficient use of his time, she said, and meant it, and also meant the other thing underneath it, the thing that wasn't about efficiency at all. He crossed the room in 2 steps and did something she hadn't quite expected. He took her hand, not dramatically, just picked it up and held it in both of his, the way a person holds something they're being careful with. I'll try to be what you deserve, he said. That's all anyone can try, she said. They stood like that for a moment, and then Lydia's voice came from the back room, sleepy and wondering. Papa? Naomi? Is everything okay? They stepped apart. Silas cleared his throat. Everything's fine, he called. I heard talking. We were talking. A pause. Okay. Another pause. Naomi, will you come check on Rabbit? He fell off the bed. Naomi looked at Silas. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was ordinary and enormous at the same time. Go, he said. I'll check the fire. She went. Pete Marvel's message came the next morning before 8 o'clock, delivered by his eldest son on a fast horse. The message was 3 sentences. Found it. October 14th, 1871. Entry. Come today if you can. They went. Silas, Naomi, and Aldrin rode to the Marvel homestead by mid-morning, and Pete met them at the door with a journal open in his hands, already turned to the right page. Joseph Marvel's handwriting was cramped and meticulous, and what he'd written on October 14th, 1871, was 4 paragraphs about the boundary survey of the Rowan claim. He described the survey day, clear and cold, he wrote, which was how he remembered most of his important days. He described the formation he called the Split Rock, which matched the name Deller's Rock in the way that 2 witnesses to the same event sometimes give the same thing different names but describe the same thing. He described the Eastern face profile in terms that were specific and measurable, the kind of detail a man writes when he wants to remember something exactly. And he wrote, and this was the part that mattered most, the part that Aldrin read twice with his jaw set and his eyes focused, that the boundary of the Rowan claim ran 6 yards east of the formation's easternmost face at ground level, which placed the creek clearly, unambiguously, entirely within the Rowan property. This is good, Aldrin said. Not expansively, just, this is good. Coming from Aldrin, it was enough. Pete Marvel looked at Silas. My grandfather was an honest man, he said. He believed in boundary lines staying where they were put. So do I, Silas said. I'll testify to the provenance of the journal, Pete said. That it's his, that I've kept it, that I haven't altered it. I'll bring it to court. Crow will push back on the chain of custody, Naomi said. They'll argue the journal could have been changed. My grandfather dated and initialed every page, Pete said. Both sides of every page. 50 years of journals, same method throughout. He paused. Let them argue against 50 years of the same habit. The circuit judge, a compact man named Harlow, who had the particular weariness of someone who'd spent 20 years riding between Wyoming's disputes and had seen most of what people were capable of doing to each other over land and water, arrived in Blackstone on a Wednesday. He set up in the back room of the only building large enough, which was the feed store, and he began hearing what had been filed. Crow's case was first, which was also Victor Crow's preference. He'd filed first, he'd get priority, and arriving early in a judge's schedule when the judge was still fresh was not an accident. James Aldrich presented the fraudulent survey results with the smooth competence of a man who had done this before. And Naomi, sitting in the back of the room with her hands folded in her lap, watched and listened and noted every claim and every word with the stillness of someone who is doing several things at once inside their own head. Crow sat in the front, 2 seats from his lawyer, and he looked once at Naomi when she walked in, and then looked away. And she understood from that one look that he'd been told about the marriage. His jaw had tightened in a way that was small and telling, the tightening of a man who has made a calculation and discovered the variable he'd dismissed has changed. She was no longer merely the housekeeper with no legal standing. She was Naomi Rowan, wife of Silas Rowan. And that was a different thing entirely. Aldrich presented for 40 minutes. He was good. He was smooth and precise, and the fraudulent survey he presented was convincing. In the way that good frauds are, not obviously wrong, just quietly dishonest in ways that required knowing where to look. Judge Harlow listened with the same expression throughout, which revealed nothing. When Aldrich finished, the judge looked at Silas. "Mr. Rowan, response?" Silas stood. He was not a man who spoke in front of groups. Naomi knew this about him by now. He communicated in direct, economical language that worked perfectly in private and became something he had to visibly manage when there were other people listening. She'd watched him prepare for this, the way he'd gone over the main points with her the night before. The things to say, and the order to say them, and she'd watched him practice saying them out loud with the particular difficulty of a private man performing a public function. He stood up and he said what needed to be said. Not eloquently, not the way Aldrich had said it, but clearly and in the right order and without losing the thread. And when he said it, he looked at the judge and not at Crow, which was the right choice. Then Aldrin testified about the counter-survey. He was precise and credible, and when Aldrich cross-examined him, he answered every question without flinching, including the hard one about Deller's Rock's changed profile, which he addressed directly. The western face is altered, yes. The eastern face, which is the actual survey reference, is consistent with the original description within acceptable tolerance. I can demonstrate this with measurements. He demonstrated it. He had the drawings. He had the numbers. Then Pete Marvell took his grandfather's journal to the front of the room and read the October 14th, 1871 entry aloud in his quiet, solid voice, and set the journal on the table in front of Judge Harlow, and answered Aldrich's questions about chain of custody and provenance with the unshakable calm of a man who knew exactly what he was holding and why it mattered. Aldrich pushed on the journal. He pushed hard, suggesting alterations, suggesting that memory of a dead man's habits was not evidence, suggesting that the document could not be authenticated without expert analysis the court didn't have time for. Judge Harlow looked at him and said, "I've been reading documents for 30 years, Mr. Aldrich. I can see consistent aging and consistent hand throughout. Your objection is noted and overruled." Aldrich sat down. Crow had not moved through any of this. He sat with his hands folded and his face showing nothing, and Naomi watched him with the care she'd been watching him since she'd first heard his name, and what she saw was not panic. It was recalculation. A man who had expected to win, finding that the ground under the plan had shifted and deciding, quietly and quickly, whether there was another angle. She kept watching. Judge Harlow called a recess for 1 hour. People shuffled and stood, and the room broke into low conversations. Victor Crow stood and walked toward the door and passed within 5 feet of where Naomi sat, and he stopped. He looked at her for a moment. His face was controlled but not completely, in the way that faces never are completely when the calculation has gone wrong. "You've caused me considerable trouble," he said. He said it quietly, without heat. "You caused it yourself," she said, equally quiet. "You sent men to frighten an old man on a road." Something moved in his eyes. Not remorse, nothing as human as that. More like adjustment, like a man filing new information. "The judge hasn't ruled yet," he said. "No," she agreed. "He hasn't." Crow looked at her for another moment, then walked out. Silas appeared beside her. He'd watched the exchange from across the room. He didn't ask what had been said. He'd read it from the distance. "You all right?" he said. "Fine." She looked at the door where Crow had gone. "He's not done. He's thinking. What do you think he'll do?" She looked at Silas beside her, this man she'd known for 5 weeks and married 3 days ago in front of a judge who'd seemed both surprised and unsurprised, the way judges get about human behavior after enough years of watching it. "I think he'll let the judge rule," she said. "And then I think he'll look for the next angle. Men like Crow don't stop because one thing didn't work." She paused. "But right now, today, I think we've given Judge Harlow enough to see what happened." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Whatever he decides. We did everything we could." She nodded. Outside the feed store, the October wind moved through Blackstone the way it moved through everything out here. Not asking, not waiting, just going where it was going. Somewhere on the other side of 40 miles of that wind, the creek ran over its stones, clear and cold and consistent, the way it had been running for as long as anyone in this county could remember. Inside the feed store, in the back room, Judge Harlow sat with the documents in front of him and thought about honesty and fraud and 50 years of a dead man's careful journals, and did the thing that judges do when they are still, occasionally, the thing they were supposed to be. He read every page. Judge Harlow took 2 hours. That was longer than most people in the feed store had expected, which meant different things to different people. To Aldrich, sitting near the front with his papers organized on his knees, it meant the judge was genuinely weighing the evidence, which was not what he'd wanted. He'd wanted a fast ruling, the kind that came from a judge who'd already made up his mind before he sat down. Fast rulings in property disputes usually favored whoever had filed first, whoever had the cleaner paperwork, whoever looked more like the kind of established power that circuit judges didn't enjoy contradicting. 2 hours meant Harlow was actually reading. To Silas, 2 hours meant sitting on a wooden bench with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and nowhere to put the waiting except into the stillness he'd learned to produce on the outside, while everything else moved on the inside. He sat next to Naomi and didn't say much, which was how he sat next to her most places, but the quality of the silence was different in public than it was at the kitchen table. More exposed, more aware of itself. Naomi spent the 2 hours doing what she always did when she was waiting, she thought. She went back through the testimony, through Aldrich's arguments, through the specific language Harlow had used when he'd overruled the objection about the journal. She thought about Crow, who had not returned to the room after the recess, which was information. A man who was confident in the outcome stays to watch it arrive. A man who has doubts finds somewhere else to be. She thought about what came after, whatever the ruling was, because she was the kind of person who always thought about what came after. Crow's comment at the door, "The judge hasn't ruled yet," had not been a threat exactly, but it had been a reminder that men like Crow operated in longer time frames than a single court session. A loss today was a setback, not a stop. She'd seen this with her father's cases. The people who lost when the law worked correctly didn't always accept the loss. Sometimes they went around it, sometimes they waited and came back from a different direction. She'd have to watch for that. She'd already decided she would. Old Denny came in from outside 20 minutes before the judge returned, stomping cold off his boots, and took a seat behind them with the economical movement of a man conserving energy for whatever came next. He'd been outside the whole time, which was where Denny went when he needed to think and couldn't pace indoors without bothering people. He didn't say anything when he sat down. He put his hat on his knee and looked at the door to the back room. Pete Marvel was 3 seats to the left with his grandfather's journal tucked under his arm. Closed now, its work done. He caught Naomi's eye and gave a brief nod that meant nothing specific and everything general. "I'm here. We did what we could. Let's see." The door opened. Judge Harlow came back to the front of the room with the same expression he'd carried throughout, which revealed nothing right up until he set his papers on the table and looked up and said, without preamble, "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both parties. I'm going to be direct about what I found and what I'm deciding and why." The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when something real is about to be said. "The survey produced by Mr. Purvis on behalf of Mr. Crow contains a fundamental error in its treatment of the reference marker for the western boundary of the Rowan property," Harlow said. "Mr. Aldrin's counter-survey demonstrates, with credible measurements and clear methodology, that the eastern face of the Dellers Rock Formation remains consistent with the original 1871 survey description within acceptable tolerance. Mr. Purvis's survey ignores the eastern face entirely and bases its boundary revision on the changed profile of the western face, a face whose condition is acknowledged by both parties to be the result of natural rockslide, not any change to the original marker's legal function. Aldrich had gone still across the room. Furthermore, Harlow continued, the journal entry produced by Mr. Peter Marvel, attested to as the authentic writing of his grandfather Joseph Marvel, witness to the original survey, provides corroborating description of the boundary placement that is consistent with the Rowan land grant documents and inconsistent with Mr. Purvis's claimed boundary line. He paused. I am not in a position to determine in this proceeding whether Mr. Purvis's survey was produced in bad faith. That is a separate matter. What I can determine is that it is not credible as a basis for boundary revision, and I will not accept it as such. The room had a kind of weight to it now, the weight of a held breath. The western boundary of the Rowan property, including the creek running along that boundary, is confirmed as described in the original 1871 land grant. Mr. Crow's challenge is dismissed. Harlow picked up his pen and made a note. We're done here. Naomi felt Silas's hand close around hers under the edge of the bench. It was not a dramatic gesture. He didn't squeeze hard or make a production of it. He just put his hand over hers and held it, and she felt the tension in his fingers and the slight unsteadiness in them, which was the only version of relief that Silas Rowan was going to let anyone see in a public room. She turned her hand over and held his back. Around them the room began to move again, voices coming up from the silence, people shifting and standing. Aldrin was making notes. Pete Marvel stood and buttoned his coat. Denny made a sound behind them that was not quite a word. Aldrich gathered his papers with the precise movements of a man who is very angry and performing composure and walked out without looking at anyone. Victor Crow was not there to receive the news in person, which was itself a kind of statement, the statement of a man who had considered the odds carefully enough not to be present when they came in wrong. Silas stood. Naomi stood beside him. He was not a man who showed things broadly, but the line of his shoulders was different than it had been 2 hours ago. Something in it had released, some load-bearing tension that he'd been holding for so long he probably didn't know it was there anymore until it went. Pete Marvel came over and put his hand out and Silas shook it, and Pete said, "My grandfather would be glad," and Silas said, "Thank you, Pete, for all of it." And Pete nodded and tucked the journal more firmly under his arm and walked out to where his son was waiting with the horses. Old Denny appeared at Silas's left shoulder. He looked at Naomi, and she looked back at him, and he said, "I'll drive the wagon around," which was Denny for several things at once, including things he was never going to say out loud. They stood in the nearly empty room, Silas and Naomi, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Aldrin was at the table across the room collecting his documents, giving them the particular privacy of a man who understood when to be busy elsewhere. "It's not over," Naomi said. Not to diminish the moment. Just because it was true, and Silas knew it was true, and pretending otherwise would be the kind of comfort that wore out before you got home. "I know," he said. "He'll look for another angle, maybe not right away, but eventually." "I know that too." He looked at her. "But today we won." "Today we won," she said. He nodded, once, slowly. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do before in any public setting. He reached up and put his hand briefly against the side of her face, just for a second, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, and then dropped it. It was not much. It was also more than nothing. "Let's go home," he said. They drove back in the wagon with Denny on the seat and Naomi and Silas in the back, which was not the arrangement they'd started the morning with, but felt right for the return. The sky had gone the particular pale blue of late October afternoons, bright without warmth, the kind of sky that told you winter was close but hadn't committed yet. The hills on either side of the road showed yellow and brown where the last of the season clung to the grass. Naomi watched the landscape go by and let herself feel, for a few minutes, what she'd been managing through the whole 2-hour wait. Not triumph. It wasn't that clean. More like the physical sensation of a weight she'd been carrying forward, finally being set down. The particular bodily relief of a tension that has served its purpose releasing. She was tired in a way she hadn't been willing to be before now, a tiredness that went back to the train platform and possibly before that, to the moment she'd seen the canceled wire and understood what it meant and decided to come anyway. She'd made the right choice. She knew that now, which was different from believing it when she'd made it. Back then it had been logic and instinct, and something she couldn't have named. Now it had form. Now it was the ruling and the journal and the credible survey, and a 5-year-old back at the ranch with a cloth rabbit and her father's eyes, waiting. The ranch came into view as they topped the last rise, low and solid in the afternoon light, smoke coming from the chimney that meant the fire had held. Lydia was on the porch. She'd been watching the road. Naomi could tell by the way she was standing, not playing, not doing anything, just watching the road with her whole small body oriented toward whatever was coming. When the wagon came over the rise, she went still for a moment, and then she came down the porch steps and across the yard at a run that was not careful or controlled, arms going, rabbit left forgotten on the step. She reached the wagon before Denny had fully stopped it and grabbed the sideboard and looked up at both of them with her face wide open, all the careful, provisional love dropped entirely in the face of needing to know. "Did we win?" she said. Silas got down from the wagon and crouched to her level, something Naomi had watched him do more often in the last weeks, coming down to the child's height instead of making her look up, a small shift that wasn't small. "We won," he said. Lydia looked at him for a moment, processing it. Then she threw both arms around his neck and he caught her, straightened up with her held against him, and for a moment he just stood there in the yard with his daughter's arms around his neck and his eyes closed. Naomi climbed down from the wagon on her own and went to pick up the rabbit from the step before it got colder, and stood for a moment on the porch and looked at them. At Silas and Lydia in the yard, at Denny climbing stiffly down from the wagon seat, at the house behind her with its level shelf and its banked fire, and its winter stores that were better now than they'd been in October. Not enough yet, but better, more than survivable if they kept at it. This was not a perfect picture, she knew that. The fence on the south line still needed 2 posts come spring. The kitchen account was thin after paying Aldrin. The gap in the bedroom wall was filled but not properly fixed, and would need attention before February. Silas still went quiet in ways that had nothing to do with her sometimes, went somewhere behind his eyes that was still his and still not fully open, and probably would be for a while yet, maybe always in some corner. And Lydia still woke from nightmares sometimes and needed to be sat with in the dark, and would for a long time. Because grief in a child doesn't move on a schedule. None of it was clean or resolved or finished. It was just continuing, which was the best you could say about any living thing, that it was continuing. Lydia looked at Naomi over her father's shoulder. "Is Rabbit okay?" she asked. "Rabbit's fine," Naomi said. "A little cold. He was waiting on the step." Lydia reached out for him, and Naomi crossed the yard to hand him over. And Lydia took him and pressed him to her chest, and looked at Naomi with those dark eyes from her secure position in her father's arms. "I knew we'd win," she said. Silas made a sound that was partly exasperation and partly the other thing. "Did you?" "Yes." She said it with complete serenity. "I knew when she got off the train." Naomi looked at this child who had apparently been operating on her own certainties from the beginning, who had looked at a stranger on a cold platform and made a decision that the adults around her were still catching up to, and felt something in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for either. "You're going to be a formidable woman," she said. Lydia considered this seriously. "What's formidable?" "It means the kind of person other people should pay attention to," Silas said. Lydia thought about this, decided it was acceptable, and put her head down on her father's shoulder. The 3 of them went inside. Denny took the horses to the barn, alone, the way he preferred most things. He took his time with the bay and the other horse, rubbing them down in the particular methodical way he'd done for 11 years. And in the quiet of the barn, with the winter smell coming through the slats and the horses breathing steady around him, he permitted himself something he didn't permit often. He thought about Eleanor Rowan, who had died in August the previous year in the back bedroom, while the summer heat pressed down on everything. He thought about the months after, when the house had gone silent and cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather, when Silas had moved through his days like a machine running on something other than wanting to, when Lydia had started asking the kind of questions that children ask when they've learned the hard way that the world doesn't stay the way you need it to. I thought about a woman stepping off a train at dusk with her good gloves and her measuring eyes, and the specific quality of stubbornness he'd recognized in her even through his own skepticism. The kind of stubbornness that wasn't stubbornness exactly, but was something closer to rootedness, a quality of being planted rather than merely standing. He'd been wrong to doubt her. He knew that now. He'd been operating on the accumulated evidence of every person who hadn't stayed, and she'd arrived and stayed, and that was the whole of it. He put the brush down and stood for a moment in the barn's quiet. "All right," he said to no one, in the way old men sometimes talk to no one, which is to say to the accumulated weight of years and the people in them. "All right, then." He went in for supper. It was 2 days after the ruling that Victor Crow left Blackstone County. He didn't announce it. There was no public statement, no acknowledgement of the ruling, no visible response to the loss beyond the fact that his household began moving things with the quiet efficiency of people who have been told to pack without being given a reason why. The large house with its large ambitions stood for another week, with different people coming and going, and then it was still. James Aldrich filed the paperwork for dissolving Crow's Blackstone County land holdings from an office in Cheyenne 3 weeks later. The northern and southern parcels that had been purchased specifically to box in the Rowan property went back to the territory's land office, unclaimed, without sentiment. Naomi heard about this from Garrett at the general store, who told her with the particular satisfaction of a man who had been afraid of Victor Crow for long enough that the absence of him felt like a physical relief. She thanked him for the information and bought what was on her list and went home. She didn't feel triumphant about Crow's departure. She'd learned from her father that the absence of a bad thing wasn't the same as the presence of a good one, and celebrating the former was how people confused relief with progress. The creek was still theirs. That was the good thing. That was what mattered. The person who had tried to take it being gone was just the world correcting a mistake it shouldn't have made in the first place. What she thought about instead, on the ride home with the late November cold coming down in earnest now, and the wagon loaded with winter supplies that the account could actually carry, was the spring. She'd been thinking about the garden. Not a big one. Nothing elaborate or ambitious that would promise more than could be delivered. Something practical. Potatoes, beans, turnips, some herbs if she could manage them. A section of ground in the southeastern corner of the yard where Eleanor used to sit, where Lydia felt her mother close. She'd asked Lydia about it, carefully, not wanting to disturb something that belonged to the child, and Lydia had thought about it for a long time with the rabbit pressed to her chest, and then said, "Mama would want a garden there. She always said she was going to plant one." That was enough. She'd started drawing it out on paper in the evenings when the day's work was done, and Silas was doing his accounts, and Lydia was asleep. Not elaborate drawings, just the shape of it, what went where, what could grow in Wyoming's short season. What would actually survive the first frost? Practical decisions. The kind of forward thinking that was not hope exactly, but was the behavior that hope produced, acting as if next spring would come, because it would, because it always did, because that was the one reliable thing about seasons. Silas had found the drawing one evening on the table and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he'd said, "There's good sun in that corner through May and June." "I know," she'd said. "The soil's rocky, but you can work it." I figured. He'd put the drawing back where he'd found it and gone back to his accounts, and that was all. But the next morning she'd found, leaning against the outside wall of the house in the southeastern corner, 3 long-handled tools that were better than the ones she'd been planning to use. Better balanced, better made, clearly taken from the barn where they'd been stored for reasons she didn't ask about. That was Silas. The thing he couldn't quite say, he did instead. She understood him better now than she had in October, and she expected to understand him better still in a year, and better again after that. And she also understood that there would always be rooms in him she was still finding, which was not a problem, but a true thing about people. You didn't finish knowing someone. You just kept going. December came in with its full weight, and the ranch moved into the particular rhythm of winter. Slower, more interior, more focused on maintaining than building. Silas and Denny made the last fence repairs before the ground froze solid. Naomi got the winter stores properly organized and calculated what they had and what they'd need and found, with some satisfaction that they were going to be all right. Not comfortable exactly, but all right. Which was its own kind of abundance when you understood what the alternative looked like. Lydia turned 6 in December, which Naomi had not known was coming and Silas had not mentioned, and she discovered it 3 days before the date from a comment Denny made in passing. She had 3 days to do what could be done, which was not much but was something. A cake that used the last of the good flour, a cloth doll she stayed up 2 nights making from scraps in the mending pile, a length of ribbon she'd bought in Blackstone without knowing exactly why, which turned out to be the ribbon that went around the doll's waist. On the morning of Lydia's birthday, the child came to the kitchen table and found the cake and the doll and the ribbon and sat down and looked at all of it with her serious face, and then looked at Naomi, and then looked at her father, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she picked up the doll and held it next to the cloth rabbit, the two of them side by side. "She needs a name," Lydia said. "She does," Naomi agreed. Lydia thought about it for almost a full minute. "Eleanor," she said. The kitchen was quiet. Silas had his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and he was looking at the table, and Naomi watched him absorb his daughter's simple, enormous decision and hold himself very still with the effort of it. "That's a good name," Naomi said. Lydia examined both figures together, adjusting them, making them even. "They can be sisters," she said, with the decisiveness of a child organizing a world into something that made sense. "Yes," Naomi said, "they can." Silas looked up. His eyes were dry. He was too controlled for anything else in front of people. But the quality of his face was open in a way she'd only seen a few times. He looked at Naomi across the table and the cake and his daughter's bowed head and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying, because they both already knew what the moment was. He reached across the table and cut the cake. They ate it in the small kitchen of the still-standing ranch. The three of them and Denny, who came in from the cold and looked at the cake and said, "Huh," in the specific way he said things that meant more than the word. Lydia explained the doll's name with complete seriousness, and Denny listened with complete seriousness and said, "Good choice," and ate his piece of cake in 3 bites. Outside, the creek ran under its skin of thin ice, cold and persistent, and entirely where it belonged. The winter was long, as Wyoming winters were. It was hard in the practical ways. Wood management, water management, the particular cabin-close tension of people sharing small spaces through months of cold. There were difficult evenings. There were mornings when the work was nearly more than the available energy and nearly won. There were days when Lydia was unreachable in her grief, and days when Silas was unreachable in his, and days when Naomi herself sat in her room and felt the specific loneliness of being far from everything she'd known and wondered, briefly and honestly, what she'd walked into. She never regretted it, but she never stopped feeling the weight of it either, and she decided this was right, that a life that mattered should have weight, that the things worth doing should cost something, and that the cost wasn't evidence of a mistake but evidence of real stakes, real people, real ground under your feet. In February, a letter came from Walt Greer. He'd written it in his own hand, careful and apologetic and warm, and he said he'd heard the ruling had gone the right way and that he was glad. He said he thought of the Rowan family often. He said his daughter had made him promise not to take any more long rides in October, which he thought was probably wise. He closed by saying that he hoped the creek was running clear, because in his experience, clear water was the most reliable sign that a place was doing all right. Naomi read the letter at the kitchen table and then handed it to Silas and went back to what she'd been doing. He read it and set it down and was quiet for a moment. "We should have him out in the spring," Silas said, "when the road's good." "Yes," she said, "we should." And in April, when the frost finally let go and the ground came back and the days began lengthening in the particular hopeful way of spring on the frontier, Naomi went to the southeastern corner of the yard with the 3 tools that had appeared against the wall back in November, and she began to turn the soil. It was rocky. Silas had been right about that. It resisted the first pass of the tool and the second, and she worked it down in sections, the way her mother had worked the garden in Pennsylvania, with the same method of patience over force, giving the ground time to understand what was being asked of it. Lydia came out and watched for a while, sitting on the fence rail with Eleanor the doll and the rabbit together in her arms, the way they always were now, inseparable, sisters. Then she climbed down and came to stand beside Naomi. "Can I help?" "There's a smaller tool in the barn, the one with the short handle." Lydia went and got it without being told twice, and came back and started working the dirt beside her, not very efficiently, with the energy of a 6-year-old who has decided to be serious about something. Silas appeared on the porch at some point, the way he often appeared, quietly, without announcing himself, just present. He watched them for a while. Naomi could feel him watching without turning around, the particular quality of his attention that she'd come to recognize the way you recognize a sound that recurs until it becomes familiar. "You're going to need more seed than you ordered," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I ordered more than I told you." A brief pause. "Of course you did." She almost smiled, keeping her eyes on the ground. "The bean rows need to go north to south. More sun that way." "I know how to plant beans, Naomi." "Then come help," she said. There was a moment, and then she heard his boots on the steps and across the yard. He came and stood beside her and looked at what she'd started and at Lydia working with total commitment 3 feet away. And then he picked up one of the tools and started working the section beside Naomi without ceremony, without any production of it. The 3 of them turned the soil in the southeastern corner of the yard, in the place where Eleanor Rowan used to sit, and the morning light came across the hills the way it came every spring morning, without asking, without waiting, just arriving. It was not a perfect day. Naomi's hands were already sore and the ground was giving her more rock than she'd hoped, and Lydia had gotten distracted by something in the dirt that turned out to be an earthworm. She then needed to introduce to both Eleanor the doll and the rabbit. Silas hit a rock the size of a boot and said something under his breath that he then glanced at Lydia about, and Lydia pretended not to have heard it with the expression of a child who absolutely had heard it. It was a completely ordinary morning. It was also the kind of morning that, if you were paying attention, you understood was not ordinary at all, but was the actual substance of what a life was made of. Not the rulings and the crises and the moments that would make a story later, but this. The cold and the dirt and the sore hands and the earthworm and the tool hitting rock and the light coming over the hill. What began as a mistake, the agency sending the wrong woman west, the wrong train, the wrong platform, had made the right thing happen in the way that life sometimes did its most important work, not through careful planning, but through the particular stubbornness of people who refused to get back on the train when everyone expected them to. Naomi Rowan pressed the first seed into the turned earth and covered it over with her hands, and the creek ran clear and cold behind the western hill, and the ranch continued what it had always been doing and would keep doing for a very long time, holding on and building, both at once.